In the early years of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler and his military leadership had achieved success after success across Western Europe. By the summer of 1940, Germany stood dominant from the Atlantic coast of France to the borders of Poland, having defeated major armies in a matter of weeks and established control over vast territories. But for Hitler, this was only the beginning. His greatest ambition, the core belief that had shaped his political ideology and strategic vision, was the conquest and domination of the Soviet Union. He viewed the vast lands of Eastern Europe and Russia as Lebensraum, living space, that he believed the German people needed to expand, grow, and secure their future. He also held deep ideological hatred for the Soviet system, seeing it as a state controlled by what he described as enemies of civilization, and he was convinced that the Soviet Union was structurally weak, politically unstable, and could be destroyed quickly and easily. Plans for the invasion began to take shape as early as July 1940, even before the Battle of Britain had reached its conclusion. Military commanders were ordered to begin studying the terrain, the transport networks, the strengths and weaknesses of the Red Army, and the best ways to move massive forces across thousands of kilometers of land. The operation was given the code name Barbarossa, named after the medieval German emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a leader who had led expeditions to expand German power and territory centuries earlier. The name was chosen deliberately, linking the coming campaign to a long history of military conquest and national ambition. The scale of the preparation was unprecedented in the history of warfare. Over the course of almost a year, Germany assembled the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. By the time the operation was ready to begin, more than 3 million German soldiers, supported by 500,000 troops from allied nations including Romania, Hungary, Italy, and Finland, were positioned along the western border of the Soviet Union. They were equipped with over 3,500 tanks, more than 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,700 aircraft, and tens of thousands of military vehicles, horses, and supply wagons. The force was divided into 3 major army groups, each assigned a specific objective. Army Group North was ordered to advance through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. Army Group Center, the largest and most powerful formation, was tasked with striking directly eastwards towards the city of Moscow, and Army Group South was directed southwards into Ukraine, aiming to capture the rich agricultural lands, industrial centers, and natural resources of the region. Alongside the military buildup, a massive propaganda and deception campaign was put into place. To the outside world, and even to many within the German military, the movements of troops and supplies were presented as defensive measures or as preparations for an attack on Britain. Messages were leaked suggesting that Germany was simply reinforcing its eastern borders to protect itself, and maps and documents were deliberately created to give the impression that no action against the Soviet Union was planned. Even diplomatic relations remained outwardly normal. Trade agreements continued, goods and materials flowed across the border in both directions, and there was no official warning or declaration of war sent in advance. In Moscow, warnings of the impending attack had been arriving for months. Intelligence reports from spies, information from foreign governments, observations from military officers, and even reports from ordinary citizens living near the border all pointed clearly towards the fact that Germany was preparing to invade. But Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, refused to believe what he was being told. He was convinced that Hitler would not break the non-aggression pact the two nations had signed in 1939, and he believed that any reports of an attack were either mistakes or deliberate attempts by other powers to force the Soviet Union into war. He ordered that no defensive preparations be made that could be seen as provocative, and that troops should remain in their positions and avoid any action that might give Germany an excuse to strike. This decision left the Soviet military dangerously exposed and unprepared, with units spread out, supplies stored in vulnerable locations, and defensive positions incomplete or non-existent. The invasion was originally scheduled to begin in mid-May 1941, but delays caused by military operations in the Balkans pushed the date back by more than a month. This delay would later prove to be one of the most significant factors in the outcome of the entire campaign, though at the time it was seen only as a minor setback. The final date was set for the 22nd of June, with the attack to begin in the early hours of the morning under the cover of darkness and the confusion of dawn. In the hours before the attack, a strange silence hung over the border regions. Soldiers on both sides knew that something was coming, though many of the German troops had only been told their final orders in the last few days. Across the vast frontier, stretching more than 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, hundreds of thousands of men waited in position, their weapons ready, their vehicles warmed up, their eyes fixed on the land that lay ahead. At exactly 3:15 in the morning, the silence was shattered. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire simultaneously, sending shells crashing down onto Soviet positions, barracks, airfields, railway lines, and communication centers. The ground shook with the force of the bombardment, and flames began to rise into the dark sky as buildings, vehicles, and supplies were hit and set alight. Within minutes, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, began its attacks, flying low across the border to strike at airfields where hundreds of Soviet aircraft were still parked neatly in rows, lined up as if on display. Most of these planes were destroyed before they could even take off, giving Germany complete control of the skies within the very first hours of the fighting. As the artillery fire shifted forward, the ground forces began their advance. Tanks and armored vehicles moved across the border bridges or forded rivers, followed closely by columns of infantry, motorized units, and supply trains. The speed of the movement was astonishing. Using the tactic known as blitzkrieg, lightning war, which had proven so successful in previous campaigns, German armored units drove deep into Soviet territory, moving fast and bypassing strong points and centers of resistance, leaving them to be dealt with by the infantry that followed behind. Their goal was not simply to defeat the enemy in battle, but to break through their lines, cut their communications, surround their armies, and destroy their ability to fight back. The Soviet forces were taken completely by surprise. Many units woke to find enemy troops already within sight, and communications broke down almost immediately as telephone lines were cut and command centers were captured or destroyed. Orders became confused or failed to reach the front lines at all, and soldiers often found themselves fighting without instructions, without support, and with little idea of what was happening elsewhere. In the first few days and weeks, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Entire divisions and even whole armies were encircled and captured or destroyed. Thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles were abandoned or seized by the advancing Germans. By the end of the first month of fighting, German forces had advanced between 300 and 600 kilometers into Soviet territory, capturing major cities, vast stretches of land, and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Behind the front lines, the reality of the invasion was far darker than any ordinary military campaign. Hitler and his commanders had issued orders long before the attack began that defined how the war would be fought. This was not to be a war between nations in the traditional sense. It was presented as a war of annihilation, a struggle against what they called an enemy ideology and a way of life. Special units followed behind the fighting troops, tasked with identifying and executing political officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and anyone seen as a threat to German control. Civilians were treated as subjects to be controlled, used for forced labor, or driven from their lands, and millions of people would suffer hardship, hunger, and death as a direct result of these policies. As the summer months passed, the advance continued. Army Group North moved steadily through the Baltic states, capturing Riga and Tallinn before closing in on Leningrad. By September, the city was completely surrounded, cut off from all supply routes, and surrounded by enemy forces. What followed was a siege that would last for almost 900 days, during which hundreds of thousands of people would die from starvation, cold, and disease. Yet the city would never fall. Army Group Center achieved the most dramatic early successes. In the battles around Bialystok and Minsk, more than 400,000 Soviet soldiers were captured or killed, and the road to Moscow seemed to lie open. But even as they moved forward, problems began to appear. The distances involved were far greater than anything the German army had faced before, and the infrastructure of the Soviet Union was very different from that of Western Europe. Roads were few in number, often little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud when it rained, making movement slow and difficult. Supply lines stretched longer and longer, becoming harder to protect and more vulnerable to attack from Soviet forces operating behind the front lines. Fuel, ammunition, and food became harder to deliver in the quantities needed, and the speed of the advance began to slow down. Army Group South faced the toughest fighting of all. The terrain in Ukraine was open and flat, ideal for large-scale battles, but Soviet forces here were better prepared and fought with extraordinary determination. There were fierce clashes around the cities of Zhytomyr, Uman, and Kiev. The battle for Kiev, which took place in late summer, became one of the largest and most destructive battles in history. More than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped and captured, and the city fell to German forces. But the time taken to win this victory cost the German army valuable weeks that would never be recovered. By the beginning of autumn, the initial momentum of the invasion had been lost. German commanders had believed that the war would be won in just 3 or 4 months before the arrival of the harsh Russian winter. They had planned and equipped their forces for a short campaign and had not prepared for fighting in freezing temperatures or deep snow. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that the Soviet Union was not collapsing as expected. The Red Army was reorganizing, bringing fresh troops from the eastern regions of the country and learning how to fight against the German tactics. Soldiers were fighting with greater courage and determination, motivated not just by orders or ideology, but by the knowledge that their homes, their families, and their country were facing destruction. As September turned into October, the German High Command made the decision to launch one final major offensive, aimed directly at capturing Moscow. The operation was given the code name Operation Typhoon, and it involved gathering all available forces and resources for one massive push towards the capital. At first, the advance made good progress, and German troops reached positions less than 30 kilometers from the city center. They could even see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance, and it seemed that victory was within their grasp. But then the weather changed. Heavy rains arrived, turning the already poor roads into seas of thick, sticky mud that trapped vehicles, slowed movement to a crawl, and made it almost impossible to bring up supplies. Tanks and heavy guns became stuck where they stood, and soldiers had to march long distances through conditions that exhausted them and wore down their equipment. When the rains finally stopped, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the first deep freeze of winter arrived earlier than usual. Temperatures fell far below zero, dropping to -20, -30, and even lower. The German soldiers had been issued only summer or light autumn uniforms and had no proper winter clothing, no cold weather equipment, and no protection against the extreme conditions. Engines froze solid, weapons jammed, fuel became thick and difficult to use, and thousands of men began to suffer from frostbite, cold-related illnesses, and exhaustion. At the same time, fresh Soviet forces arrived in the region, elite divisions that had been held in reserve in the far east of the country, brought to the front once intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack from that direction. These troops were experienced in fighting in cold weather, were properly equipped and trained, and were led by some of the most capable commanders in the Red Army. In early December, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive. The tired, cold, and weakened German forces, already stretched to breaking point, were pushed back from the outskirts of Moscow, forced to retreat and give up much of the ground they had gained at such great cost. For the first time in the war, the German army was in retreat, unable to hold its positions or continue its advance. By the end of 1941, Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve any of its main objectives. Moscow had not been captured, Leningrad still held out, the Soviet army had not been destroyed, and the Soviet Union had not surrendered or collapsed. The war that Hitler had planned to be over in months had turned into a long, bitter struggle that would last for another 3.5 years. The cost of the campaign was almost beyond measure. By the end of the year, German casualties alone numbered more than 800,000 men, killed, wounded, missing, or captured, along with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles destroyed or lost. Soviet losses were far higher still, running into millions of soldiers and civilians dead, wounded, or taken prisoner, and vast areas of the country left in ruins, with cities destroyed, industries smashed, and farmlands laid waste. The failure of Operation Barbarossa marked the turning point of the entire Second World War. Germany was now forced to fight a war on two major fronts, facing powerful enemies both in the East and in the West, a situation that would eventually lead to its total defeat. What had begun as a plan for rapid conquest and easy victory had become the greatest military disaster in German history, and the events set in motion on that summer morning in June 1941 would shape the future of Europe and the world for generations to come. Today, Operation Barbarossa is remembered not just as a military campaign, but as one of the most destructive and tragic chapters in human history. It stands as a reminder of how ambition, ideology, and overconfidence can lead to decisions that bring suffering and destruction on a scale almost impossible to imagine, and how the determination and resilience of people fighting for their homes and their freedom can change the course of events in ways that even the most powerful leaders could never predict.